viewers, and welcome to Spotlight here on Hope TV, where you look and live. And on Spotlight, we do our very best to bring to you perspectives that will enrich your conversations, at the same time inform your Christian action. And when we listen to voices in our society, usually there'll be two main voices. There'll be the voice of good, and there'll be the voice of the gangsters. In terms of action, there will be the force that really wants to make this country a good country. At the same time, there's a force that wants to make this country a gangster country. And it's interesting that we find in a view given by Jesus Christ in Matthew chapter 13, verse 24 through to 30, about what we can call a mixed farm. Good, gangster, mixed farm. Now, Jesus was a sharp analyst and critic of his society. Often he coded his observation and discernment in images and symbolisms that captured great depth, yet with an accessibility that ordinary people would appreciate, as in the parable of the weeds. Every farmer knows that the success of the crop is to a great extent dependent on the failure of the weeds. If weeds thrive, the crop will turn weak. The leaves will gain an unfriendly color, and the yield, which is the ultimate goal, will drop drastically to the frustration of the farmer. Now, the weed that Jesus talks about in the parable definitely is not a normal weed. It is a weed sown by an enemy. A weed sown at night when no one is watching. It is not an accidental weed. It is sown deliberately. It is not a natural weed. Even the regular weeds could notice an alien weed, a new weed in town. It may be a kind of weed that is cultured in a laboratory after a carefully done study of the crop which it is meant to finish. It is a lethal weed, a weed sown maliciously and militantly with one mission: to finish the wheat. Like a guided missile, it is an intelligent weed, one that may even camouflage itself such that only a really keen farmer would spot it. But contrary to normal agricultural practice, Jesus in the parable is giving a strange wisdom. He advises his servants to let the weeds stay. He states firmly that if the weeds were removed, the crop would die. Paradoxically meaning that if you keep the weeds, you will save the crop. In this wisdom, he sets up an interesting form of mixed farm. One which does not know a weeding season. It does not know a weeding season because it is legally a farm of weeds and wheat. But for Jesus to allow such a malicious, enemy-crafted weed to grow in the midst of the wheat, he must have known something about the wheat. He must know that the wheat is made of resilient, tough stuff. He must be confident enough that the wheat can survive the malice, tough enough to not only survive, but to thrive. He must know that the weed will not threaten the yield. Now, in one of the daily newspapers, I read the story of a man who was shot with a bullet years ago. Now, the bullet is still lodged somewhere in his head. According to the article, it was judged too dangerous to remove the bullet. The surgical process to dislodge the bullet would jeopardize the life of the man. He will live longer and better if the bullet is left in his body. Now, the story of the bullet left to lodge in the body of the old man for the sake of elongating his life supports the wisdom of Jesus in the mixed farm of weeds and wheat. Let the weeds stay for the sake of the crop. The weeds will not be removed, but the crop will not be moved. The kind of mixed farm of weeds and wheat expressed by Jesus is not a secluded and theoretical description. Rather, it tells of the experience of all of us as persons, as communities, and also as a nation. The parable describes the reality of our lives. Now, there are primarily two forces that seek to claim us in almost every path: the power of darkness and the power of light, the path of right and the path of wrong. We can go the way of the wheat or the way of the weeds. And in all these cases, and your personal experiences, I'm sure, can confirm this, the power of the dark, the wrong, and the weed always seem to be more creative, even more convincing. It's no wonder we have been victims to its attraction often. Paul confesses when he is writing to the Romans that, I do not understand my own actions, for I do not do what I want, but I do the very thing I hate. For I do not do the good I want, but the evil I do not want is what I do. For I delight in the law of God in my inmost self, but I see in my members another law at war with the law of my mind and making me captive to the law of sin which dwells in my members. You find that in Romans chapter 7, verse 15 through to 23. There is a struggle in each one of us between the spirit and the flesh. Threats to your good existence come from outside of you, and some really vicious ones come from inside you. Now, vividly, even at our very personal level, we are a mixed farm. We have wheat and weeds working hard to dominate us. But it is you who decides what farm you want to be. A wheat farm with weeds or a wheat farm with wheat. Now, John the Revelator tells us about the church in Pergamum, and he says this about it: I know where you dwell, where Satan's throne is. That's in Revelation chapter 2, verse 13. But the hopeful thing is that despite this reality, there are a few good things that God says about this church. The verse continues to say, you hold fast to my name, and you did not deny my faith, even in the days of Antipas, my witness, my faithful one, who was killed among you where Satan dwells. But the fact that this church was located where Satan dwells did not spare them from the bad, from the critic of God. The account goes ahead to say, but I have a few things against you. And John the Revelator goes ahead to list them. We would have expected God to sympathize with this church that is doing its best in this city called where Satan lives. But God still goes ahead to list some accusations against them. This puts a harsh lesson to all who regard themselves church people. The presence of Satan is no excuse for our deterioration. The presence of hard conditions does not lower God's standards. The presence of pain does not excuse us from being and remaining godly. Our immediate communities have both the schemes of God and the schemes of Satan simultaneously at work. They are a mixed farm of wheat and weeds. But there is grace enough for the godly to come out shining at the end. We cannot tell the weeds from the wheat in our leaders simply by looking at their party affiliations. It is God who taught Samuel when he went to the house of Jesse to anoint David as king over Israel that people look at the outside appearance, but the Lord, I look at the heart. One's wheat or weed status, one's wheat or weed status cannot be simply judged by their external words and their party affiliations. The truth lies in their consciences and in their hearts. The enlightenment from the parable of the wheat and the weeds makes us aware of the possible lookalike camouflage. We have to derive and build a spiritual intelligence, a discerning capacity that listens beyond the words and instead engages in knowing the hearts. This capacity for fine discernment is one of the things that will make the church be and remain relevant. This capacity for fine discernment is what will make today's church a born-again church, a church that stands out. And working from this spiritual intelligence, we may be surprised, if not shocked, at who in Kenya today is on the wheat side and who is on the wheat side. This is a season of reconstruction. Let us be on the wheat side of things. We are all witnesses of what seeds of corruption, manipulation, and evil competition can yield. Now, one artist sang and said, "Lessons learned and pages turned." Because God has in His great mercy often spared us from greater destruction, we would be mocking His mercy if we befriend and insist on old habits, destructive vices. God will not be asking too much from us if He asks us to live our lives to rebuild our nation as a people who have learned. While we look up to the high political leaders to set as worthy examples equivalent to their offices, Christians and citizens must also spread the wheat spirit in our zones of authority and our areas of responsibility. With lessons learned and pages turned, how good and pleasant it would be if all of us nurtured a wheat-friendly philosophy, if we all carried a wheat-friendly spirit in our jobs, homes, and in our recreation times even. Let us not be anxious about the mixed bag, for God is the Lord of the harvest. Mixed as it is, the Lord is the Lord of the farm called Kenya. He will not abandon us in the hands of the master of the weeds. Our God, the Lord of the wheat, who is also the Lord of the harvest, sometimes lets the weeds and the wheat grow together, not so that the wheat may be maliciously destroyed, but so that the wheat may lovingly see maturation. This has been Spotlight. Thanks for watching.